All right, good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and try this again. I think we were having some difficulty. It looked like when you pressed on the video, it was only like a 1-minute video of me typing, which probably isn't what you wanted to see tonight when you signed up for this. So let's try this one more time. I'll send out an email to everybody. You need to refresh the page at cradle.org/hangouts, and then you should be able to press the play button and get us live going again. So again, tonight, I want to thank you for hanging out with the Cradle, and my name is Mark Arneson, and with me tonight is Dori Fujii. Many of you know Dori. She is one of our therapists for our Center for Lifelong Adoption Support, and she's going to talk to you about parenting the adopted toddler. And really our goal tonight is just to answer questions that you have. We put this Hangout together to really be available to families. We do appreciate that adoption is a lifelong process, and all of you can really testify to that more than anybody. I mean, you know that life is quite different today than it was when you first brought your child home, and the challenges that you face and the questions that you have are quite different. And so we want to be available ongoing to you, to support you, to guide you, to help answer those questions. Dori does have a lot of questions that you guys sent in advance, and so we want to thank you for that. And if you do have other questions that come up, right above me is my email address. So click on it and send me an email, and I'll be checking those as we move along tonight. And I'll pass them on to Dori so she can respond. So with that, I will hand it over to Dori. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And apologize again for the technical difficulties. I think, Mark, you said that it would be, I know that this is bedtime for families, and Mark and I debated whether to go ahead and just, forge ahead with doing this. And he assured me that this will be archived. Is that right, Mark?
It'll be on that page.
It'll be on this page. And so if you just have to say, that's it, I'm going to put my kid to bed, see you later, that's fine, because you'll be able to call this up again tomorrow when you're not trying to put your kid to bed. So with that said, let me go ahead and just kind of jump back in here and tell you that we have the average age of the families who are with us tonight are about the age of 2 or a little bit older. Makes sense, class of 2011, 2012. 17 families are domestic, 4 are international. I wanted to kind of let you know that the questions that we got quite a few questions ahead of time. And they kind of fell into a number of, I would say sort of general categories. Those categories included how do you talk about adoption? How do you bring up the topic? What do kids at this age really understand? There were questions about navigating an open domestic adoption. There were questions about navigating life changes with your child, recognizing that your child has a history of some separation and loss already, and wanting to be sensitive to the way in which your child might experience changes in the family. And then the final questions had to do with how do you balance sort of the demands of independence and attachment at this age. Kids are doing a lot of pushing away, being on their own, and yet they're kind of at the same time never leaving your side. So, I think that's the general category of questions. I want to be sure and cover some resources at the very end. We have about 30 minutes, so I'm going to just go ahead and thought the best way to begin talking about is just to review really quickly what are kids doing at this age. So you have like a toddler, you live with them every day, but the things that are sort of really notable about life right now is that they are really talking, and even if they're not totally intelligible, you're beginning to really be able to communicate with them at a new level and a more significant level. They're able to be aware of your feelings, they're expressing their feelings. You're often beginning to use phrases with them like, use your words, tell me, even if they're small words. Certainly by the time your child is 3, 3.5, or 4, most kids have pretty good vocabulary by that time. I can't tell if it's working. Most notably, kids are at this age you're being able to sit down and tell your child a bedtime story understand those stories, and they can ask questions about them, and they can remember the story and want to hear it again. What does it mean? It means they are old enough to understand the beginnings of their story. Kids at this age are believers in magic and fantasy. They're make-believe kids. They're starting to have fears and fantasies. They're noticing differences between themselves and other children and between themselves and you. Kids by the age of 3 very often are noticing, your skin is one color, my skin is a different color. They're around other children whose parents and families are having little brothers and sisters, so they're really learning more about, like, where do babies come from, or they surely have questions about that. They continue to be very literal, however, in their understanding of where do babies come from, what's going on with the world in general. I think the way I like to think about talking about adoption with kids is really to realize, adoption is an adult concept. It's really complicated, and when parents sit down to think about how am I going to talk to my kids about adoption, it feels pretty overwhelming. So the analogy I like to use is the analogy of learning to read, which is if you're going to teach your child to read all in one day, it would be too much. However, if what you're doing when you're doing talk about reading readiness in terms of school, and the way you kind of help kids learn to read is you do things like you present letters in their life, you help them recognize shapes, and then one day they understand an A is an A and a B is a B. They begin to string letters together to make words. They realize words have meaning. They recognize maybe their own name. They recognize mom and dad. And pretty soon they're beginning to read, and they realize that words have meaning, words make sentences, etc. So you're not trying to teach that all at once. And if you thought you were going to try and teach it all at once, it would feel like way too much. Same is true in talking about adoption. Not trying to teach all about adoption all at once. What you're doing right now at this particular age is really beginning to lay the foundation to really provide information that unfolds for your child across the lifespan in chunks that they're old enough to understand. So what are you doing at this point in time? Basic tasks. Providing basic information about their birth story. You're acknowledging the specialness of birth parents and birth country. You're creating a climate of open communication with your child about many different things, including adoption, but not only adoption. It's just a time when you're creating a time when you're able to talk about feelings, having your child feel that they can share with you, that you take their experience seriously. You want to begin normalizing the experience of adoption so that they are aware that families are made in many different ways. You come to adoption things at the cradle, talk about adoption within your family, just talk about different kinds of families. Begin using proper terminology for body parts, because one of the discussions about adoption really ends up being a discussion about where babies come from and how babies are made. Certainly, most kids at this age really think of as adoption as special. They're not as aware of the complicated parts of adoption. But I think families are ahead of time cautious about that. Parents see down the road, so they want to think of a way of protecting their child from the hurt, the sadness of adoption, some of the loss. And I think it's probably, it's important for parents to sort of make peace with the fact that there are sad parts of adoption. Your child will have some sad feelings, may have some angry feelings, and that there isn't anything that you as a parent have done wrong because your child is unhappy. I mean, most of us don't like our kids to be unhappy. I've got young adult children, and I still don't like it when they're unhappy, and I have to remind myself that it's okay for them to be that there are some sad things and that that's okay and I should be there to support them, but that I can't always fix it. And that's certainly true with respect to talking with your child about adoption as they grow older. So let's start with now. So we're creating this foundation. How do you bring up the topic of adoption if you haven't already done so? Well, I would say, again, if you think back about how did you learn about your own birth story? How did you know about any pieces of it? Most oftentimes people say, adults, I don't really remember when I knew that. I always just knew it. And that is really, I think that's the easiest way to introduce the topic. Yeah, that's the easiest way to introduce the topic of adoption to your child, is to just begin talking. Your child's young enough to talk about things like, you know, when we first met you, I can remember when this is what was going on, and when we brought you home from the hospital, or when we traveled overseas to meet you when we first adopted you. So you just begin using the word adoption in everyday conversation. I mean, adoption is like just any other word to your child at this age. It's a world that they're learning to understand more about. I mean, even the concept of families, kids at this age don't really understand what a family is unless over time you begin to teach them what that is. And it's also similarly true with the whole concept of adoption. So what the question comes up, what can my child understand about adoption at this age? Not a great deal, really. But it's they understand bits and pieces. I mean, I remember a family that said, my child says, I'm adopted, or I'm a adopter. And that the family said, parent said to the child, what do you mean you're a adopter? He goes, well, I'm a doctor, like I go to the doctor. And, I get a checkup. And so the child had kind of totally mixed up being adopted with being a doctor. And it was just kind of all jumbled up in this little one's head. And that's, that very often is what's happening at this age, as kids just begin to sort out, what is the adult world saying about how I started out. If you haven't already, you may begin talking about your child's tummy mom, and that your child grew in somebody else's tummy, but that birth mom had problems or had things that were going on in her life that made it her not able to take care of a child at that time. But you were a family who was ready and wanted to do this, and that the birth mom, made a plan of adoption because she wanted what was best for her child. I think you can probably say that under most circumstances, in some way, without being disingenuous. I have a question about how often and how much should we talk about adoption? Well, families have said, we feel like we're pretty open about it, but we're not always talking about it. Well, let's think about, how can you, I do think it's probably a good idea to be somewhat intentional about adoption, just because, again, if you're a conspicuous family, adoption's coming up all the time. People are asking you, they're asking your child, even if they're not old enough to understand the whole conversation. They're beginning, the topic of conversation of adoption comes up just because you're conspicuous. But if you're not a conspicuous family, families are having to work a little bit more intentionally to talk about adoption in terms of, reading it. I would say, again, I'm a big believer in the importance of stories, books about adoption, little, young kid books about adoption. Have a really good reading list if you want that. You can certainly email me at the Cradle and we can send that out, or can talk with Mark about how to make that available through this website. Certainly, probably the single most useful tool for families is really working on a life book for your child. If you haven't already begun to do that, I would say now is a really good time to do that. The life book should start from the time your child was born, not the time that your child joined your family. Sometimes it takes some thinking about. I would say maybe it takes calling your counselor here at the Cradle if she or he is still here, kind of reviewing, kind of like, how would I do that? You can always call me and talk with me a little bit about, I just need an hour of sitting down and really going over this, and reviewing, how do I get started? I think that's very often families just need help getting started, and once they've gotten started, they're okay. But it's kind of, sort of that first step can be difficult with a life book. Certainly there's an Adoption Learning Partners class on life books, still very helpful. It's been there a while, but it's still a good class. Again, how else can you talk about adoption? Different kinds of, just books about different kinds of families, about diversity, any books that are about same and different. I think, I guess if all the books for children this age that I like, Mr. Rogers' book on adoption is as good a book about adoption as any I can think of. And if nothing else, it's really good for parents because it gives you all the talking points. The talking points are when you're talking with your child, children need families. Adoption is an adult decision. There are times when birth parents are not ready to take care of a baby, and there are other parents who are. It's never the baby's fault or the child's fault that their birth family cannot take care of them. And then certainly, the message of adoption is lifelong, and I will always be there for you. Those are, sort of the permanence of adoption, and the adoption as a plan is real important for kids. Mr. Rogers, just does a nice job of that. He was, there's adoption in his family, and I would say it's a good book. Lots of, photographs of fairly different kinds of families, not as diverse as I would like, but. And then the other thing you can certainly do in terms of talking about including adoption in your daily life is to incorporate adoption into your family rituals and traditions. That can be as simple as, if you're a family that says grace or says prayer at dinner, at bedtime, that you include the birth family and birth country in the child's, the things that they're praying for or saying grace for. Families light candles. They remember birth parents at times of birthdays. There are any number of ways of just making rituals that honor birth country and birth family. I have another question here about sharing difficult stories or having, what about an open adoption relationship that starts to be difficult? One of the questions I think comes up for a number of families, and that is the question of, like, what do we do if the part of our child's story includes the issue of abandonment? How do we talk with our child about that? I think first off, I think the term abandonment is rightfully, understandably so, and kids will say this. It's a hurtful term, and so if I think one of the questions had to do with a child who was left in the hospital. And I would say that in terms of that particular situation, or a child that was born in China and needed to be left, I think there's a way of talking about it that is a little bit less harsh and probably equally as true without the harshness of the term abandonment. And so a discussion, you have to ask yourself, how do you feel about giving this explanation? Say for a mom, the birth mom in China who left a child, or the birth mom who left a baby in the hospital. How would you feel about saying your birth mom knew that she could not take care of a child at this time, that babies need a great deal, and all babies do, and she wanted to be sure that there were people who could take care of babies, and she knew when she was in the hospital that the people in the hospital knew about babies, and she knew that you would be safe there and that the hospital could find somebody to take care of you. She did not know what to do, so the decision she made was to leave you in a safe place. And, you know, that's how it started, that you eventually came to join our family. Now, is that a story of abandonment? Yeah, it is a story. I mean, that's abandonment in some ways, in my mind, is a legal term more than it is a term of, it never really accurately conveys what a birth parent must have experienced in having to make that decision. It's always, regardless of how that occurs, a very difficult decision with many, many complex factors that surround it. Obviously, a child at this age is too young to understand all of that, but they're not too young to understand that a birth parent said, I am not ready to do this, but I want my child to be safe. And I want to find I want a family who is ready to do this. So again, hopefully that kind of discussion, the issues of safety and readiness to be parents are really very paramount for kids at this age. Let's talk some about open adoption, since there were a lot of questions about that. And I would say, particularly now that your child is 2 or 3, you may find that some of the, if you're in a domestic open adoption, that the level of contact and the frequency may have fallen off. You may have lost touch with the birth family and wonder, now what? What should I do? Should I keep reaching out to her? Should I, or to the birth father? How do I kind of manage this, or do I figure just sort of leave it alone? I think one of the things to do then is remember, to think about what is your role as an adoptive parent in an open adoption or in any adoption. And I would say that it is that you're the steward of the relationship between your child and the birth family. That means that you're taking a leadership role there. You're always, whether it seems fair or not, the family that's going to take the initiative if the other party can't. And the reason I think that is that birth parents make a plan of adoption because they're not ready to be able to parent. And it also very often means they're not ready to be able to take the initiative to keep the relationship going. I can't tell you how many birth parents have come back later down the road, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, and said, I thought about my child, I wondered about my child, and I know that the adoptive family has continued to reach out, and I was finally ready. I felt like I was judging myself too harshly, and I finally forgiven myself, and now I can come back. So I think, again, if you find that the birth family is not responding to your letters and pictures and emails, whatever, you can send annual updates to the Cradle. We will keep a file for you here, letters, pictures. The birth family, if they want, when they're ready, can come back and they will have a record of the fact that you've sent every year and remembered them every year. And even if they don't, when your child comes back and they're a little bit older, and you come and look at the things that you've set here at the Cradle for our birth family, your child will know that this is a relationship you valued. The other thing that some families do is they make a box at home for the birth family, and the birth family's out of touch. I've seen this more with families that I work with through DCFS, kids who really knew their birth parents lost touch. And just say to the child, we're just going to put this once a year. We're going to at least put a picture that you drew, a picture of yourself at school in this little box aside. And, when we see your birth family, if we see your birth family, it will be ready for her and for, your birth father. So it's a way of continuing that relationship and continuing to acknowledge the importance of the birth family, whether or not they're there. there's been some questions about different levels of openness for different kids, and I agree that that can be complicated. One of the ways to, I think you have to explain it is that each child has their own separate story, and that it is often, I think, obviously for the child whose birth parent is not there, they have a lot of questions about what does it mean. It may not necessarily, kids wonder, did I do something wrong? Is my birth family mad at me? Is something wrong with them? Are they okay? And I think that is, it really is back to every family has its own story. Every birth family has its own story, and helping your child to really talk with you about what that might mean to them. I think that very often when kids have questions, parents can ask more questions rather than necessarily answer immediately, and try and find out from your child really what more is your child thinking about that. If they bring up birth parents, to say, you've been thinking a lot about your birth mom again, or you've been thinking about her today. Wonder what you're thinking. Like, what do you think she might be doing? And just doing a little bit more inquiry with your child to find out kind of where that question is coming from for them. I think the other thing is to acknowledge that, yes, it is hard sometimes when one birth parent is there and the other birth parent isn't. It's sad and it's hard. And I think those are things that is part of your child's story. I don't know more specifics about that, how to elaborate on that. But I think the other thing that can very often be helpful is to have if the other birth parent who is involved and has some openness, if you talk with that birth parent, and ask, have you thought about ways of explaining, like, do you have a perspective on this? That's one thing. And I think the other thing to say as an adoptive parent is, I imagine this might be why, or I imagine this might be one of the reasons that we don't have openness right now. There are lots of different reasons why that doesn't happen, and it's never because of the child. It's always an adult reason. Let's talk about birth siblings. Again, birth siblings, either before who are older and still at home with mom and dad, or birth siblings whom parents decide to parent after they've made an adoption plan for the child that you're parenting. Either of those two situations is hard for kids sometimes. Some kids are like, well, whatever, this is my family, not a big deal. That's their temperament. They just are go with the flow kids. And there are other kids who feel really lots of, even at this age, a little bit of confusion, a little bit of hurt about that. Again, the important message about adoption still always is an adult decision. It truly is an issue of readiness and timing when birth parents make a decision for adoption or they decide to parent. Very often birth parents are able to parent the older children because they have the resources to parent one or two children, but they don't have the time, the energy, the resources, the support to parent a third child. Very often the situation for the birth family has changed by the time they have a subsequent child. They've gotten older, they've become more stable. They are now in a position to parent a subsequent child in a way that we're not ready at the time they made an adoption plan for your child. And that is, that really is the case. It's not that that's untrue. It is the way in which adoption unfolds for many birth families. But I think that is, again, it's one of the difficult aspects of adoption, but it is a part of the story that, again, you need to talk with your child about and explain. Hopefully, as a parent yourself, you feel some understanding and some understanding of the birth parent's perspective. And at some point, if you find yourself really upset and really angry about that, which can happen, I mean, I think that's normal and pretty natural for families to get upset about. Sometimes the decision making that birth families make that seems, just not wise. Then sometimes that's the time to sit down and talk with an adoption professional or somebody else, another adoptive parent, to kind of just get your feelings dealt with, so you can go back and deal with your child. It's not the same as like being it's not the same as being in a divorce, but in some ways it is, in the sense that you have a relationship and you were hoping and expecting it to go one way, and you feel disappointed about the way the path it's taking, and you feel that your child is being hurt along the way. Those are hard feelings. It's tough, and I think it takes very often it takes you time and space to sort that out. Let me see what else. What other questions do we have here? Yeah.
Somebody emailed a question.
Yeah, we've got a question about what about birth parents who aren't reliable and miss visits.
And this one maybe it's a birth father's not mentioned in the adoption paper. What's the best way to handle questions about birth father?
The birth, okay.
If we don't know anything about him, like, and we get questions, how do we handle that?
Okay. Well, okay. So we have a question about what about birth parents who are not reliable and miss visits. Well, I would say a couple of things. All of us have people in our lives who are not as reliable as we want them to be, birth parents included. I think that one of the ways you manage that situation is that you buffer, as adoptive parents, you're the buffer around those visits. Meaning, if you think that the birth parents are going to be unreliable, what you do is you don't tell your child that the visit is scheduled until really close to the time that that you know that the visit is happening, that you've asked the birth family to confirm that visit with you the day of the visit, and you then don't, create a situation in which if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I know that's easy for me to say, and it's easier said than done, but it is the way that families manage this. It's it's not unlike a situation in a split custody situation where one of the parents in a separating couple is less reliable about showing up than others. Are kids disappointed? Yes. Do you say, we have a plan B, and you don't necessarily include your child in that part of the decision making until it's really close to time? I think that's a good idea for kids at this age. Certainly I would say in general, your communication with the birth family, with kids at this age, I would not really include them in all of that discussion, whether you got an email or phone call or any of that stuff, any more than you would have a lot of conversation with your child about a call from a grandparent or anybody else. Those are kind of details that kids at this age don't really need. There was a question about birth fathers. How do we begin to talk about our child's birth father if he's not mentioned or not named? And I think the answer is you say, we don't know a lot about your birth father. There wasn't information that your birth mother was able or willing to share. But everybody has a father, a birth father, and you can talk a little bit about how you imagine he might have been, really by just knowing who your child is. You probably have some idea about his race. You have some idea about maybe the color of his hair. There are things you can imagine. You can say, think about, he probably, I bet you got your brown hair from your dad, from your birth father. Again, this is a 2 or 3 year old. Older on than that, obviously you're beginning to think now, What about later on, like when my child is 9 or 10, and we say we don't know who the birth father is? How do we explain that? And you do have to say, again, later on down the road, you're beginning to set the groundwork for how do we choose our friends? How do we make decisions? That discussion is, it's a discussion that unfolds over time. But at this point, that everybody has a birth father and a birth mom, that it takes a man and a woman to make a baby. Those are reasonable things to say. And usually, typically at that point, kids are done. Let's talk a little bit about preparing to welcome another child through adoption. What will my toddler understand about adoption? Again, probably not a lot. At this age, what your child is going to be most aware of is having a brother or sister, being part of that adoption process, if it's a domestic adoption, being here for the, coming to the cradle and visiting the nursery before the baby goes home, being here, on the day of placement, maybe not for, depending on how that goes. Very important for kids because it's an opportunity for them to begin to learn about their own adoption story. Are they going to understand a great deal about it? No, probably not. But they will have those pictures and that experience of having gone through this with you as a family. And I think that's sort of the most significant piece of this. Questions about attachment versus independence. Yeah, this is one of those ages where your child is it's come here, go away, right? And there are very often times your kids are clinging to you and they won't let you out of their sight. And there are other times when they're really pushing for, I can do it all myself, even if they can't. So I guess the concepts that might be helpful to you in thinking about kids at this age are two concepts. One is the family or the parent as a secure base. And what kids really do at this age, and for quite a while, really for a long time, even to adolescence and young adulthood, is to use their families as a secure base. They feel really good at home, or they take a hug from mom and dad, and then they dart out. They go out into the world, they adventure. They go and do a bunch of adventures and things and come back. If they go out and they're really scared or they're a little bit more cautious in temperament, they might stay closer to home for a while, gather up their nerve and get enough encouragement to kind of go ahead and take that next step out again. The other concept that I think is real helpful at this point is the analogy of learning to ride a bike, which is a lot of time with training wheels, and then little by little parents let go a little bit at a time, gradually. And that's, so I don't know that the issue is issues of attachment and independence. It's attachment and independence. It's both. And kids, if it seems confusing to you, it's because kids are going back and forth. And you're like, well, I thought I understood it, but now it doesn't seem like I do. And it's really, kids are doing a lot of this coming back for what people call in the business, kind of refueling, feel better, get a hug, go out in the world again, do that for a while and then come back. And you'll see that with kids really throughout the lifespan. I mean, even kids who go to college, I mean, even at that age, very often kids go off to school, but they want to come back for spring break, or they want to, have mom or dad down for parents' weekend or something like that. So there's still that sort of like, I need to get out in the world, but I need to come back and touch base. Let me think. It's a little bit after 8. I know there's some more questions. Don't think we have time to take any more of them. I want to refer you to a couple of things. Again, you've all got Adoption Learning Partner accounts, I believe. The class on life books, talking about adoption, the class on grief and loss, and the class on conspicuous families. You took those before you were parents. Those mean a great deal. Families hear that really differently once they're parenting. You're like, it's kind of like, oh, now I understand that in a different way. So I encourage you, go back, revisit those classes. if you feel like you need like a little bit more one-on-one, you know, that's why the Center for Lifelong Support is here. I'm here on staff. I'm an adoptive parent counselor. I'm also, you know, half-time in the Center for Lifelong Support. Judy Stigger is also here. What are the ways that you might use that the services here? Well, one would be just a one-time consultation to come in and say, you know, these are the things that are going on. I just need help thinking it through. I just call that these kind of like periodic tune-ups. I think that can be really helpful. I've had parents come in and say, we're having this particular issue around separation with my child. I don't know if it's adoption or not, but I could use some parent coaching and some ideas. Somebody who's familiar with this area, with these issues, to bounce that off of. That's another good use of our time. There's sometimes that families are really dealing with some issues of attachment and behavior management with their kid. And again, a really good use of our time. That may be a more short-term counseling around how to deal with your child, or, you know, a little bit of attachment, you know, play-based attachment work with your child, with you and your child either here, probably here, sometimes at home, depending. I don't know, Mark, are there other questions right now that pop into, come right up?
No, we haven't had any other questions.
You haven't had any other questions? Okay. So
you have a workshop coming up on April 12th?
We do have a workshop coming up on April 12th. It's going to be a panel of adult adoptees. I think we've got four people who have agreed to speak, internationally, domestic, inconspicuous adoptions, and not. I think they're going to be talking mostly about what it was like growing up during the tween and teen years. So I always think it's a really nice idea to have that information with you when your kids are really young. So you have that vision down the road. Okay, where are we headed? And how are those, how are kids, various kids, different temperaments, different experiences, likely to encounter the experience of being adopted as they grow older? I think that's it. I want to thank you so much for joining Mark and I tonight. I think Mark's going to wrap this up and tuck your kids in bed, and certainly email me with questions if you have them. And I'm going to turn this back to Mark.
Thanks, Dori. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight as well, hanging out with us. I do apologize again for the technical difficulty that we had. Hopefully we got it resolved, and I hope that everybody was able to watch. We're going to keep this up on the site, on this page, for a while now, so if you want to come back and take a look at it again, feel free. We'll keep it up for a while so you can do that. I know that you may have missed some of the beginning of it. And we're going to try to do these a little bit more often. We'll obviously have different topics, and we'll get notices out to everybody to let you know when those are going to be happening.
And any feedback that you have.
Yeah.
You know, aside from like you have terrible technical difficulties, but you know, other topics you'd like to see, or you know, because we never did this before, so we're trying to be in the 21st century. So
that's right.
Most appreciative of your willingness to pioneer this with us.
All right, thanks you guys. Have a good night. Bye.